My name is Richard Meyer, and I am the Interim Executive Director for the Center for the Ethics and the Rule of Law, or CERL, at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. On behalf of the Center, I would like to welcome you to our kickoff event for our conference labeled Left of Launch, Communications and Threat Escalation in a Nuclear Age. This event will be a keynote panel featuring Congressman Adam Smith, Dr. John Harvey, Brigadier General Patrick Huston, and Dr. Amy Nelson. CERL is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting the rule of law in 21st century national security, warfare, and democratic governance. We draw from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in contemporary transnational conflicts, as well as interstate challenges to democratic principles. I invite you all to use the CERL blog, to peruse the CERL blog to read articles and comments about a variety of important issues in the fields of ethics, the rule of law, and the preservation of democracy. After this keynote panel, the Left of Launch Conference will continue with 5 closed sessions of experts from a variety of fields and academic disciplines. The CERL method is to pose important questions to an intellectually diverse roundtable to develop novel solutions to familiar problems. Our group of experts will evaluate and discuss such concepts as the continued efficacy of nuclear deterrence, the U.S. nuclear posture, the current status of nuclear weapons under international law, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, non-proliferation efforts, and the effect of technological developments on the nuclear threat. Based on a distinguished list of participating experts in these discussions, this conference promises to be an important event for the future of nuclear policy. Before I turn this over to our moderator, I have a few housekeeping items. First, to submit a question for today's talk, please use the Q&A feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of the window. Please keep your questions topical and appropriate. Anyone posting inappropriate language or content will be removed. Second, if you are an attorney seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CERL codes will be presented twice per hour. Therefore, there will be 4 CLE codes for this 2-hour event. Write down those codes and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. You should have the form already, but if you need another copy, the link will be posted in the chat. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. These codes will tell us how long you attended. The first pass code today is the word money. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's talk, Professor Claire Finkelstein. She is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the founder of CERL. Claire?
Thank you so much, Rich. And I see Congressman Smith was already on, but I will introduce our panelists in just a moment. First, I'd like to just make a few introductory remarks about our topic, and then I will introduce all of our panelists. So I founded CERL in 2012 in order to address ethical and rule of law issues that arise in national security, and particularly in transnational warfare. In some ways, the questions surrounding the buildup, maintenance, and use of nuclear weapons raise the most profound rule of law issues that we confront in warfare today. It has been 76 years since nuclear weapons were last deployed in combat. And that, of course, was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 at the end of World War II. Germany had already surrendered. Japan had suggested it would surrender, yet the US had decided to hold out for unconditional surrender, and so the war in the Pacific had not ended. The 2 bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively, and estimates are that they killed as many as 226,000 people in one moment. I should say almost as many people who have died of COVID in the US in the past year, but in a matter of minutes, stretching over a few days for some of them. The vast majority of those who were killed were civilians. Little Boy exploded with roughly 15 kilotons of energy, and Fat Man had a blast yield of 21 kilotons. The U.S. has never fully answered the question of the morality of its conduct, and there has never been an official announcement or acknowledgement that the use of these weapons was, in fact, illegal and is illegal. Though by two significant principles of the law of war, these acts could most likely never be considered either moral or legal. These principles are known as, first, the principle of distinction, namely that civilians can never be targeted in war, and second of all, the principle of proportionality, that if indeed we had military targets in these instances, the loss of civilian life was so great as to make our conduct in that instance disproportionate. We face today a substantial reckoning with nuclear weapons as our nuclear arsenals continue to build, and we no longer are the only ones with nuclear weapons. This conference was motivated in part by a confluence of issues, issues that really require multidisciplinary cooperation, the participation of academics, public servants, experts in nuclear warfare, physicists, and so on. It seems critical that we think together not only about the policy implications, but the legal and moral implications of our current situation with nuclear weapons. In addition, this conference is co-sponsored by the Annenberg Public Policy Center, which is a premier communications center here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm proud to say our partner for a number of events and a long-term partnership that we've had with Annenberg and going forward. One of the critical issues here has to do with communication surrounding nuclear weapons. Under President Trump, the U.S. ended up holding a series of having a series of verbal confrontations with North Korea, for example, that many feared could result in a nuclear confrontation if it continued to escalate. President Trump threatened to unleash fire and fury and, quote, power the likes of which this world has never seen before. North Korea, for its part, had previously and continued to threaten the U.S., saying that it would engage in a strike of Washington, D.C. that would be an enveloping fire or that would reduce Washington, D.C. to a sea of fire and to reduce everything to ashes and flames. One of the questions then that we thought it imperative to raise is about the legality of threats to use nuclear weapons. When we talk about nuclear weapons, we usually consider only the policy or at most the legality of actual use of those weapons. But the overriding question that we ought to ask as we move forward, in addition to questions about use, is whether or not the threat to use nuclear weapons itself should be guided by international humanitarian law, and what might be the consequences for our public leaders if we concluded that the threat to engage in an unlawful nuclear strike was itself unlawful. So here to discuss this and a number of other important issues connected with the legality of nuclear weapons is a very distinguished panel. We have Chairman Adam Smith. Congressman Smith represents the 9th District of the state of Washington. The same year he graduated from law school from the University of Washington, he was elected state senator at the ripe old age of 25 years of age. In 1996, he successfully ran for the U.S. Congress, and in 1997, he was assigned to the House Armed Services Committee, where he has spent over 2 decades as an advocate for military personnel and their families, and served for many years as a ranking member. In 2019, he became the 17th chair of that committee. Chairman Smith is a proponent of reducing our national defense strategy's dependence on nuclear weapons. Recently, in partnership with Senator Elizabeth Warren, he reintroduced the No First Use Act to Congress. So we'll be looking forward to discussing that with you, Chairman Smith. Next, we have General Patrick Huston. If you can unmute yourself, General. Brigadier General Patrick Huston is the Assistant Judge Advocate General for Military Law and Operations for the United States Army. He was previously Commanding General of the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School in Charlottesville, Virginia. General Huston has an engineering degree from West Point, a Juris Doctor from the University of Colorado, and the Master of Laws from the Army JAG School. He has previously served as the top lawyer for the 101st Airborne Division, the Joint Special Operations Command, and for Central Command. A recognized expert in military law and the laws of war, his research and scholarship is focused in particular on the legal and ethical development and use of artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, cybersecurity, and other emerging technologies. I should also say it's been my pleasure to work with General Huston previously when he commanded the JAG School. Searle held a conference on the topic of gray zone conflict in conjunction with the Charlottesville School, and we were the lucky beneficiaries of General Huston's hospitality for the first of the two series of conferences down in Charlottesville. So good to see you again, General Huston. And last but not least, Dr. John Harvey. Dr. John Harvey is a physicist and an expert in nuclear policy. From 2009 to 2013, he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs in the Obama administration. Dr. Harvey has also served as the Director of Policy Planning Staff for the National Nuclear Security Administration, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Forces and Missile Defense Policy, and he directed the science program of Stanford Center of International Security and Arms Control. From 1978 to 1990, he was a staff physicist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Since retiring from government service, Dr. Harvey has consulted with the Institute for Defense Analysis, the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the National Institute for Public Policy, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and much more. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Harvey. So I will be later introducing Dr. Amy Nelson, who will join us for the second half of our discussion. It's my understanding that the Congressman will have to leave partway through, and Dr. Nelson has generously agreed to step in at that point. So thanks to both of you. Chairman Smith, let me start off with you. You've been the chair of the House Armed Services Committee since January, and prior to that, the ranking member. You've been a leader on the nuclear issue in the House for many years. Over the years that you have been involved with this issue, is it your feeling that we've moved closer to or farther away from nuclear catastrophe? And how has this issue evolved over the period of your political career?
Well, it's hard to say how close we are to nuclear catastrophe. That's a rather big step. Being close and being there are rather dramatically different. I've been the chair actually since January of 2019, so worked on it for a few years. I think that the larger question is, where are we at on the nuclear posture review? Where are we at on the idea of what nuclear force that we need to be an adequate deterrent? And that's where I always try to sort of push the debate, is that the purpose of our nuclear arsenal is to be a deterrent. That nuclear arsenal is necessary, ironically, to prevent nuclear war, because it serves as a deterrent against Russia, certainly, North Korea. If Iran were to get the bomb, where China's at, mutually assured destruction, as frightening as it may be, actually thus far has worked. But do we need as many nuclear weapons as we're talking about, as many platforms, as many ways to deliver it? And I strongly dispute the analysis on this, and I've been through the briefings and had it explained to me why we supposedly need the amount that we need. I think we can achieve deterrence for less. So that's number one. Number two, the other thing that has developed that is very problematic is there has been a reduction in talks between nuclear powers. The U.S. and Russia are not having the same types of communications we used to have. The treaties are getting old and have not been renewed. We've never had, such treaties and dialogues with China. Certainly conversations with North Korea have been inconsistent at best. So there's a huge unknown in terms of nuclear powers communicating with each other. And at the same time, there have been a lot of changes in capabilities. Now, to my mind, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, and changing the delivery mechanisms. But people are concerned, how does hypersonics change the game? Personally, I don't know that it changes it as much as people are saying it does, but it's at least a possibility. And a lot of people don't know, and a lot of people differ on that fundamental question. How is missile defense impacting it? If you believe that your adversary has the ability to knock out all of your missiles, that's going to make you a lot more twitchy about the whole subject. And we're not talking about that. We need to better understand, the nuclear powers need to better understand their capabilities and then work together and have a dialogue so there isn't a misunderstanding, so that people don't think that there's such a thing as a winnable nuclear war, or they don't think that, oh my gosh, I have to act or they're going to destroy us. We need to increase the dialogue and I think decrease the number of weapons and revisit the nuclear posture review that was developed during the Obama administration and reiterated during the Trump administration.
So let me just follow up with you and ask you about the bill that you've just recently reintroduced, HR 2603. The bill is probably the shortest bill I've ever read, which is just a one-liner saying that we are committed to no first use of nuclear weapons. Tell me your thinking behind this bill and what you think it would actually do for us. Would it be, for example,
the thinking behind it is, what I just said, for the most part, that our nuclear weapons should be a deterrent to nuclear war and should not be used for any other purpose. And I think we need to make that clear. Now, I know a lot of military leaders want strategic ambiguity. Well, we don't want people to know what we're going to do. I get that, but there's considerable risk if your adversaries aren't sure whether or not you're going to be the first to use a nuclear weapon. Because if you're thinking about being first, well, maybe they better be first, because there's too great a risk in not doing that. I also believe that if we don't have a no first use policy, you start down that road of discussing a tactical nuclear exchange. I don't think there is such a thing as a tactical nuclear exchange. The risk is enormous of escalation, and the damage being done by setting off nuclear weapons is huge. So I want to make that clear. That's part of feeding into that idea of our adversaries need to know what we're capable of. We need to know what they're capable of so that we don't stumble into a nuclear conflict.
Do you see no first use as precluding preemptive self-defense, using nuclear weapons preemptively?
Yes, by definition.
And do you believe that?
I mean, it's in the law. I mean, as we've learned, presidents don't always feel obligated to follow the law, A, and B, they tend to interpret it very broadly when it comes to the use of the military. There's an example from Libya where President Obama claimed he was complying with the War Powers Resolution, but the only way he could claim he was complying with the War Powers Resolution was to entertain the fiction that lobbing cruise missiles at somebody was not a hostile act. So, yeah, I mean, legally, it would prohibit that. Whether or not a president would want to try to get creative to do it anyway is a much more difficult question to answer.
And I'm just going to follow up with one more question with you on that, and then I'm going to bring in our other panelists. How would you see a no first use resolution as compared with a sole purpose resolution? A sole purpose resolution being a resolution that would say the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is deterrence. And that would leave open potentially the possibility of a preemptive strike, but strictly in self-defense, which arguably might be more likely to be legal under IHL than some other uses.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I would think the sole purpose approach is just a weaselly way to not actually have a no first use policy.
All right, fair enough. Dr. Harvey, let me invite you into the conversation. And first of all, let me ask you a more general question and then get your thoughts on no first use. I'd like to ask you a version of the same question that I asked the chairman, which is, in your capacity as advising many different administrations policy, and way back to the the START negotiations with the Russians. What is your feeling about whether or not we have inched closer to the very real possibility that nuclear weapons will be used, or do you feel that we're actually in a safer position than we were before all these negotiations began?
Thanks, Claire. I'm pleased to be on this panel with Representative Smith and General Huston. I want to talk about two things. The first thing is, yes, I think it's less likely than during the Cold War that nuclear weapons will be used by the major powers. That doesn't mean the terrorists might not use them, and I believe that sense has increased. But I want to focus on two things. One is, what has changed since I got into this business in the late 70s? And what has been continuous? What area of continuity have we experienced? What's changed is Russia. When we were in the Cold War, all the way up through 1980s and late 80s, Russia was a hostile power seeking to undermine the US in many, many different ways, and also seeking to be ascendant. The Cold War ended in 1988, and all of a sudden we find out that the Russians are now sort of, if not our friends, they're our partners. And we had Gorbachev, and then we had Yeltsin, and we had an area of cooperation where we didn't think about nuclear weapons in as much as we did during the Cold War in our context with Russia. By about the period when Mr. Obama came into office, we were cooperating in many different ways. In Afghanistan, we were cooperating on supplies. We negotiated the New START Treaty and concluded the New START Treaty during Mr. Obama's first term. Since then, I think there's been significant changes. Consider Russia's open contempt for the Cold War security, post-Cold War security order. Its illegal occupation of Crimea, its ongoing war with Ukraine, its nuclear threats to US allies, its deployment of a land-based cruise missile in abject violation of the INF Treaty, its modernization programs for exotic new nuclear weapons, and the surging role of nuclear weapons in its overall security posture. Nor should we forget Russia's use of radiological and banned chemical weapons to murder expatriates who've lost favor, its support to the atrocities carried out in Syria, and its interference in the political process and elections both in Europe and the United States. All suggest the persistence of dangers for which the US nuclear deterrent remains relevant. So that to me has been the biggest oscillation in the security environment. The biggest area of continuity has been in our nuclear policy. Over 12 presidents, US nuclear policy has remained pretty much the same. And I want to just issue a few points and say where that has been. Deterring attack is the primary, but not the sole purpose of US nuclear forces. Deterrence is based not on simply having nuclear forces on their existence. It's based on their ability to hold at risk assets most valued by an enemy. Therefore, force size and capabilities matter and may be adjusted as deterrent needs evolve, either in the positive direction or the negative direction. Robust deterrence relies on a strategic triad of nuclear forces to complicate enemy attack plan, particularly survivable forces. We don't want to have to be able to, we don't want to be able to be disarmed in the first strike. We want our forces to be survivable, and that's essential for strategic stability. A robust nuclear R&D and industrial base has been critical.
We are going to get into some of the points of deterrence in just a moment. So let me ask you to hold some of these comments for the portion of the conversation where we're talking about deterrence. Can I direct your attention for a moment to the no first use question that I asked the chairman to expatiate on? would
Sure.
you be in favor of a no first use policy? And do you think that, that would get at the gravest dangers that we should be concerned to guard against here?
I understand the support for no first use. I mean, the simplicity of the idea and its potential for bolstering U.S. moral leadership in the world. After all, supporters argue the U.S. has no intention of starting a nuclear war, so why don't we just say that? I think we have to step back a little bit and understand why 5 presidents before Biden, coming from very different administrations, have all rejected a no first use policy. And indeed, Mr. Obama rejected it twice during his nuclear posture review and during his second review at the end of his administration. There are 3 major risks to a declaratory policy of no first use. The first is to deterrence. Adversaries, absent of fear of nuclear reprisal, could be emboldened to pursue catastrophic non-nuclear attack against the United States. The second risk is assurance to allies. If America adopts no first use, then allies could lose confidence in America's extended deterrence commitments to them. And indeed, we've had substantial discussion over the past decade and more with allied governments, both in Europe and Asia, that confirm that view. Finally, lost confidence in U.S. commitments presents a third risk, a risk to non-proliferation. Allies could be spurred to develop their own nuclear weapons. So those are the things we're facing as we consider support to a no first use pledge.
So I'm going to come back to some of the broader deterrence themes that you were talking about in a moment, but now let me get General Huston in on the conversation. And first, the broader question to you, General. You've had many, many years of advising commanders on the legality of their operations, as well as on the legality of using nuclear weapons. Can you just talk briefly about the framework that you use to advise them, and then tell us where you see no first use fitting into that framework?
Thanks, Claire. Actually, the short answer is I'm happy to report that I have never had to advise a commander on the use of nuclear weapons in my 35 years. And
that's good to know.
And I'm hoping the next 35 years are just as boring for all of us. I know you're looking for a little bit more than that, so I'm just going to provide some context and perhaps some information that you won't find in my bio. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I'm a near pacifist. I'm not an absolute pacifist in the true sense of the word, but I'm about as close as you can get. I believe in using military force only as a last resort. And my views on this are shaped by my experience as both a soldier and a lawyer. We all know that war is an ugly thing, and most soldiers who've been in combat are eager to avoid it whenever possible. As a lawyer, international law is really clear that military force should be used only as a last resort. Now, I tell you these things, that I'm a human rights lawyer and a near pacifist, because I think it's important for this conversation, but also because I just want you to know where I'm coming from. These are not traits that people tend to associate with an Army general, but I think it's really important that as we have this conversation. I will add a disclaimer that I'm going to give my very personal views during this conversation, which won't necessarily reflect Army policy or Pentagon policy. Onto your specific question about the framework, I'll say that the framework for the rule of law is all encompassing, and it's deliberately so. The principles for the use of force in war apply to every weapon, from a slingshot to a nuclear weapon, and everything in between, a rifle to artillery. And that was very much by design. What I will say is that applying the facts and the specific circumstances to different weapons can vary greatly, and applying them in the context of the use of nuclear weapons is extremely complex. But the bottom line is that the legal principles themselves, that legal framework and the black letter law, are the same across the board.
You know, I just have to tell you, General, that when we hold conferences, which are in Searle's case, always a mix of military folk and civilians, and we have in the past done role plays and war games and so on, the generals are always on the side of no military intervention. It's the civilians who always want to intervene or engage in some kind of military operation. So it's interesting. You may not be as atypical as you think, but it's like the surgeons will tell you they'd never have elective surgery because they've seen too much go wrong. Chairman Smith, can I ask you to respond to some of the criticisms of no first use? And again, I'm zeroing in on this topic a little bit because I see it as a helpful window in on the our thinking about the legality of nuclear weapons. You know, the criticism, and I guess what Dr. Harvey was talking about is 5 presidents having rejected this, Obama twice, is the thought that this really undercuts our deterrence. Is our deterrence strategy is the thought that either no, it doesn't, or that strategy is not really worth hanging on to anyway.
Yeah, I think it's more no, it doesn't. The latter. I don't think no first use is by any stretch of the imagination the most important aspect of our nuclear policy. You know, I understand the arguments on both sides. You know, personally, I would prefer the clarity. You know, I mean, I don't know. I'm just a logical person, and if we say we're not, you know, we don't intend to be the first to use nuclear weapons. Our nuclear weapons exist as a way to stop nuclear war. You know, I think it's a little inconsistent then to hold out the possibility that we might. And then second, as I said previously, and once I get into these discussions and people start talking about, you know, tactical nuclear weapons with lower yields, they get into a discussion, well, you know, if it's back in the day of the Cold War, but when, you know, the Soviet Union's rolling across Eastern Europe, you know, we don't have any other way to stop them, then we'll stop them with nuclear weapons. Or now, you know, it's, you know, proposed because the Russian, you know, military is not what it used to be, and they start messing around in Eastern Europe, and, you know, NATO comes in and bops them in the nose that they'll use a small nuclear weapon in order to reestablish dominance. And then, well, we'd have to come back with a small, you start talking about how you could use nuclear weapons in a fight in a way that, and I think that's incredibly dangerous, and I don't think we should do it. Because I think the more important question is how to get nuclear powers talking to each other to reduce the likelihood that any of those scenarios that we just described play out.
Since you raised the issue, Chairman Smith, why don't we talk about the issue of tactical nuclear weapons here? So, you know, the idea of tactical nuclear weapons is that we ought to make weapons smaller, less destructive, so that they might actually serve a tactical purpose and not be just completely unusable. And then that will get us better deterrence, better protection, and make it, in some sense, more credible that we'd use them, but less destructive if we do. You know, what is your view of the legality? You are, of course, a lawyer as well as a...
Yeah, and I hate to say this because I understand the whole theme here. I'm not terribly hung up on the legality, okay? Because in my experience, people do what they got to do to get through whatever situation is. Now, the legality gives you a framework of what people are considered to be socially acceptable, okay? But it's not like if you back someone into a corner, they're going to go, okay, I'd like to do this. You know, I feel like it's necessary. But as I flip through volume 32, chapter 36A point, I don't think I'm legally allowed to do that. I don't think that's good. I'm more interested in how we create deterrence based on people's interests, their balanced perception of the threats they face. As I think Dr. Harvey was saying, you know, if we have the capability of upping the cost of the other party doing that, of placing their most important assets at risk, I think that drives behavior a lot more than what happens to be in a legal framework. Now, you can negotiate within that and create treaties and legal frameworks that help emphasize those points. But I think it's far more important to think about it in terms of interests and how you can make sure that you nudge adversaries and nuclear powers to have a shared interest in not doing what we don't want them to do. So
where do you put tactical nuclear weapons on?
I think we should banish the phrase. I don't think there is anything such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. And I think we should acknowledge the fact that if you introduce a nuclear weapon into a conflict, you are taking an enormous risk of causing untold damage. And I think to the extent you talk about tactical nuclear weapon, it implies that it's like, just poke them here and then everything will be fine. So I don't think there is such a thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. I think the risk is so great that it instantly becomes strategic if you introduce it.
So on the legal side of this, let me go back to you, General Huston.
And I apologize. The bells have gone off. I got like 5 minutes across the street here. So
you got to go vote and you'll be back, I take it.
Yeah, I will. I don't know if I'll be back before you're done. It depends on how things play out over there, but I will attempt to return. I will.
Okay, we'll hope to see you again soon. Let me go to you, General Huston. Can you talk a little bit about going back to the legal framework issue and where tactical nuclear weapons might fit in with that? First of all, on the broader question, do you share the view that the use of nuclear weapons, whether it's a first use, second use, sort of just about any use, is likely to violate principles of the law of armed conflict?
No, I don't share that view, but I do think it's important that we distinguish between the law and the policy. The Congressman talked about his role in shaping policy. My role is very much focused on the law, but I do appreciate the distinction. I think we need to draw that distinction clearly during this. When we're focused solely on international law, there is no illegality with regard to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons themselves are a legal weapon. There's no per se prohibition on their use. I did mention the difficulty factually and circumstantially in employing them in a manner that is consistent. It is much tougher than it is, as I said before, firing a single shot from a rifle to ensure that you meet the standards, particularly with proportionality, which is one of the principles of the law of war. But I would say, no, I disagree with the concept that nuclear weapons can't be employed legally. I believe that they can, but it's just tougher.
And so what's an example of a legal use of a nuclear weapon?
I think the big concern with nuclear weapons is the collateral damage. But the harm to civilians in the area, non-combatants. I think if you were to attack an enemy aircraft carrier out in the middle of the ocean, the expected harm to civilian populations, there is certainly some with the radiation and the lingering effects, but the harm in a situation like that would be one where the military advantage to be gained. You compare that to the expected harm, and it would likely not be excessive, which is the legal standard.
So I'm going to get Dr. Harvey in on this question. I don't know if you want to speak to the legality of it, but you can certainly, and you're welcome to, but otherwise, could you at least speak to the effects of even small nuclear weapons and whether or not you agree that it's possible to have a deployment of a nuclear weapon that would not be excessive?
I want to say, reaffirm my agreement with Representative Smith regarding there's really, once a nuclear weapon is used, it's strategic. It doesn't, it's an unfortunate distinction that the term strategic came out in the arms control talks, the original SALT talks, in terms of nuclear weapons that can be delivered a distance greater than 5,500 kilometers, and that was strategic. Non-strategic was anything that was less than that, and eventually we got down to the tactical or theater use, which is even less than that. So I agree with him, and indeed, let's just, for historical purposes, we should recognize also that both the United States and Russia have maintained tens of thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. That is non-strategic nuclear weapons, we call them. Mr. Bush won in 1991, took us down from about 20,000 to 10,000, and most of those were tactical. And that was the end of the Cold War. His son took us down from 10,000 to 5,000, and most of those were tactical. So today, the United States has just a couple of hundred tactical nuclear weapons, and their main role is to be a demonstration of our commitment to our NATO partners to extend deterrence to them. And that basically means that we have nuclear weapons in Europe that are flown by NATO aircraft, NATO country partner aircraft. And so we're out of the tactical nuclear weapons business, basically. We don't have atomic demolition missions anymore. We don't have air defense systems that use nuclear weapons. We don't have missile defense systems that use nuclear weapons. So they're most of the tactical stuff is gone. And so the question is, what is their role? Well, the role in Europe is to demonstrate our extended deterrence commitment and to provide some capability for the United States to be able to respond. Again, most of our concept for dealing with nuclear weapons is deterrence. We want to deter the other guy from using them. Now, one of the sort of the predicament you get into is when you talk about deterrence, you have to consider the possibility that deterrence might fail. And then what do you do with them? What do you do with them? Well, I can conceive of I conceive of few situations in which a country like North Korea might use a nuclear weapon against South Korea, one of our allies, or against the United States, in which the US might not necessarily respond with nuclear weapons, because militarily we can achieve the objective without nuclear weapons. That is the objective at the end of the Korean state, the North Korean state. On the other hand, there are circumstances also when I can see the use of nuclear weapons against the United States or an ally would justifiably and indeed would be essential to assure that US vital interests were protected. And indeed, when you say that, when you talk about the use of nuclear weapons, you have to think about the possibility that of collateral damage and proportionality. But it does. But if we conveyed to an adversary that our nuclear weapons are not for use, they're only for deterrence, that is almost a non sequitur.
Right. Okay. So
adversary, if you tell the adversary you won't use them under any circumstances in terms of response, then you basically weaken deterrence and you've weakened the security of the United States as a result.
Right. So that's the issue that the general and I were just talking about. What are the circumstances under which the use of a nuclear weapon could be legal? And the example is, we use a small nuclear weapon way out in the ocean where we expect low collateral damage. But under most circumstances, right, and where we have a clear military target, but under most circumstances, there are going to be civilian populations affected, and the impact on those populations, the collateral damage is going to be enormous. So under most circumstances that we can face, including circumstances that we are poised to address, at least on a second use, it does look as though the use of nuclear weapons would be disproportionate, does it not?
I just want to say I disagree with the notion that most would be. And that example is kind of the only scenario where you could use it legally. I agree it's very tough and the population centers dramatically complicated, but I just don't want to leave the impression that it has to be that isolated of an incident.
So, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Harvey.
Our employment policy is to hold at risk certain categories of installations and facilities and capabilities in the adversary's country, so that adversary would never have an opportunity to believe that they could gain anything from the use of nuclear weapons against the United States or one of its allies. And we hold various categories of installations at risk: their ability to make war, their ability to command and control nuclear or military forces, those types of categories of things. And in an attack on the United States that employs nuclear weapons, the US response that would involve nuclear weapons would be proportionate and discriminate, but it would be not illegal in my view.
Would be, sorry, disproportionate but not illegal, or proportionate?
It would meet the criteria of proportionality and discrimination, although I don't know the legal, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand the full ramifications of each one of those terms. But our planning, every target in the inventory of the U.S. targeting database for particular adversaries has been reviewed by legal counsel to ensure that its use under specific circumstances, now mind you, would not violate the commitments that the U.S. holds itself to, and ICJ is not one of them. The commitments that the U.S. holds itself to with regard to nuclear weapons.
So actually, Dr. Harvey's point about the review, the legal review of each one of our warheads, General, can you talk a little bit about how that works and how specific the scenarios are that we identify in advance, so that, you know, when we do our legality review, we have reason to think that we've sort of covered all situations that we might anticipate with that weapon?
Yeah, what I will say, I think for the benefit of the audience, I will say that the tests are a lot like determining probable cause in a civilian setting, where there's no formula for determining whether probable cause exists. It's the totality of the circumstances, every factor you can imagine taken into account, and you end up with a subjective determination as to whether or not probable cause exists, or a subjective determination as to whether or not the proportionality assessment is satisfied. And so that is done preliminary in advance, but then it's also done at in the more immediate before a target would be struck. And it's an assessment, as I said, it's quite subjective, but it takes into account all of the factors under the law. I should review the standard for proportionality, just the black letter law of it, because I think it's worth saying, you know, it's not illegal to have collateral damage. You can have civilian casualties, and it's not illegal under the law. And again, I'm just breaking out the legal standard here. There's a policy component to this that we can discuss separately, but in terms of the law, you have to look at what the expected value of the military target is that you're hiking. Is it a high value target or something low level? And then you compare that to the expected collateral damage. And the legal standard is that the collateral damage that's expected cannot be excessive in light of the expected military value of the target. And so that is, you see, it's based on what is known or should have been known at the time the target was struck, and it's based on these subjective determinations in the view of a reasonable commander, reasonable decision maker, not in the view of reasonable lawyers sitting in the Pentagon, not in the view of a reasonable series of law professors, us all sitting in our ivory tower somewhere else, but the commander on the ground who's making the determination. So I say that because a lot of people just assume that any collateral damage, any civilian casualties is de facto illegal, and it's not.
Well, and another thing that people do tend to misunderstand is the idea that the principle of military necessity, they think, contains some kind of harm minimization principle, which it does not.
That's a misconception.
And so one of my questions, because we frequently hear this criticism of nuclear weapons, which is they're not the minimal force that we can use to get a job done. The fact that there is no harm minimization principle in IHL, and I think this is a debated point, but classically there is not. Should our calculations be different when we're talking about the use of apocalyptic or potentially apocalyptic force?
Well, our calculations in terms of the proportionality, yes, but it's what the expected collateral damage would be. Anything beyond that, an apocalyptic event, that's a huge consideration, but it's not a legal consideration for that particular strike. I'd say that's a huge policy consideration that needs to be taken into account. But just going back to the law, I agree with you. Once you're validly in a war, there is no requirement to use the minimum amount of force on the enemy that gets the job done. That does not exist. You're not required to use a less lethal means of killing the enemy when the enemy is a valid target.
Right.
I want to add one point, and that is the military assistant who carries the football that is with the president all the time has in his notebook the implications in terms of collateral deaths and other damage that could result from that particular use of nuclear weapons, that particular option. So the president is familiar, or can be made familiar if he chooses to absorb this information, with the implications of what it is he's going to to do in terms of responding from an attack on the United States or its allies. And I think that's an important point for him.
Now, Dr. Harvey, do you feel confident that those calculations capture all of the consequences of a use of a nuclear weapon? For example, do we really know at what point, say, a nuclear winter would be triggered? And are we, do we rule out the use of nuclear weapons when we believe that a single use on our part would trigger such a result?
Well, you raised an interesting point about nuclear winter because it was an issue maybe 30 years ago, quite a bit, and has returned a bit now in the context of an India-Pakistan confrontation, where there might be maybe 100 or so exchange of nuclear forces in a sort of a nuclear war on the subcontinent. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the impact, the long-term climatic impacts of such use. I mean, and there's been some studies done by folks at Rutgers, where I went to college, and there's been some studies done by Los Alamos, where I consult, actually. Basically, they differ in terms of the amount of soot from the fires that get injected into the upper atmosphere. And the soot is the mechanism that blocks the sunlight and causes the cooling. And so they agree on basically, if they use each other's assumptions, they get the same result. But if you make the different assumptions between the amount of material that gets put up into the atmosphere, you get the result that it may not be as serious as those might expect. So you have to take that into consideration, of course. But I mean, there's not a lot of solid data out there to be able to use in terms of weighing them into your collateral damage assessments.
And how could you describe the strength of your average, U.S. or Russian nuclear warhead compared to, little boy or fat man? I mean, how, the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be considered almost, tactical by today's standards. Is that correct?
Somewhere between 50 and 100 times the explosive yield of the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we're talking about fairly serious collateral damage here, even in the context of a very limited attack, which many of us believe could not be controlled and would eventually go to a cataclysmic exchange. So
you think about
with regard to nuclear weapons, the issue is deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we want to do, is deter. We don't want to fight the war, we want to deter it. But right now they exist. The other guys have them. People whose interests are inimical to ours have these weapons. And the US must retain them to maintain the what I would call, to help us give us our best chance of continuing the post-Cold War security order.
Well, let's talk now about the issue of threats. Let's assume that we are talking about a use of a nuclear weapon that would not be justified, either because it's a first use and it would not be a proportionate in the ad bellum sense to the danger or provocation that we face, or because the collateral damage would be unacceptable. How should we think about the threat to issue such a strike? And do we believe that threats should be governed by general IHL principles in addition to use? And I draw your attention particularly to Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter, which says that it is unlawful to use threats or uses of force without proper justification. General, can you speak to this issue?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think in this context, the question is, how do you define threats? And I think we have to be really careful not to take our colloquial understanding of what a threat is and confuse it with what amounts to a legal threat. I'd analogize that to more what amounts to an assault, an imminent apprehension of harm out there, or something that under international law would create an imminent right of self-defense. A threat that's taken to that level would be different. But just to back up a little bit, I think we have to start with the current state of affairs, as we discussed a little bit ago, that the use of nuclear weapons themselves are legal. This basic principle that just respects the sovereignty of nations, states out there, and says that those states can do that which is not specifically prohibited under international law. It's this old school Westphalian approach that's reflected in the Lotus case out there. And there is no outright international law that prohibits the use of nuclear weapons per se. So just starting there, I think, is important. And then moving on to the concept of threats. The canon of construction that prevails here is that if you can do the whole, if you can legally use nuclear weapons, then you can do the part. Then you can threaten the legal use of nuclear weapons. And so again, I want to distinguish here between a threat for the legal use of nuclear weapons and then a threat to use nuclear weapons in a manner that would be illegal. And so with that, I think for the latter, I would say the international law is unresolved in that regard out there. I think you'd have to look at it in the context I said before. You have to say, can you threaten? And I think if you hearken back to this concept of law school and criminal procedure and assault versus a threat, and what you can say, I'm going to kill somebody, and it doesn't amount to a threat or an assault. You can say, I'm going to kill you if the Patriots win the Super Bowl, and it's not an imminent threat or create an imminent apprehension out there. And so you look at this, and if the person, if it creates an imminent apprehension of fear such that it would rise to the level of an attack or would justify the use of force in self-defense under Article 51, I think that's where there's the strongest argument under international law that since international law is designed to try to stabilize world order and avoid unnecessary force. I think if it was a sort of threat that was imminent enough to trigger an Article 51 self-defense right, and it was a threat of an illegal use, I think that's where there's the strongest argument that would be illegal under international law, and that the UN Charter would prohibit that.
And so that the threat itself should be prohibited, not just the use. Yes, Dr. Harvey.
Claire, deterrence in itself is a threat.
Well, and that's where I was going next.
Okay,
right?
Deterrence means you're basically telling the adversary that, number one, you will not achieve your military objectives. You will not achieve your political objectives through the use of nuclear weapons. We will stop you from doing that, and we will basically beat the hell out of your country as a result.
And on some views, that even having nuclear weapons for the purpose of deterrence is therefore itself illegal. If you believe—
Claire, I've spent 20 years in government worrying about U.S. nuclear weapons policies, the stockpile, oversight, modernization, and I've basically spent maybe one interaction that brought me together with the DoD legal guys about something having to do with nuclear weapons. Now, I'm familiar with all the arguments in the international community, the ICJ, the Prohibition Treaty, and all of that. But in my day-to-day work, overseeing U.S. nuclear forces within the Department of Defense and Department of Energy, I have never come up, except once, with a legal issue having to do with anything that I do.
So I see that Chairman Smith is back with us. Thank you so much for joining us again. And actually, you came in at the perfect moment, because I'm very eager to put another issue on the table that I saved in the hope that you would return, which is the issue about presidential authorization. Shortly after Joe Biden was declared the winner of the 2020 presidential election, and up until inauguration, there was high anxiety that Donald Trump, in his increasing distress, might decide to launch a nuclear warhead. And Nancy Pelosi raised the possibility that we ought to start looking into changing sole authorization so that it is not possible to launch a nuclear weapon with the sole authorization of the president. Do you, Congressman, have a position on sole authorization? Do you agree with Speaker Pelosi, and what should we do to start thinking about this issue, and what sort of authorization should we wish for?
Yeah, I'm skeptical that changes in the law here will actually have a huge effect. I mean, I understand the problem. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, my dominant initial reaction is don't elect a lunatic president. I mean, you have to sort of be careful the president of the United States has an enormous amount of power. Launching nuclear weapons is at the top of the list. If you've got a president who's going to launch nuclear weapons, contrary to the best interests of the country, you got a whole host of problems. So that's first of all. Second of all, so what would that look like, and how would that play out? As a practical matter, and I'm sure Dr. Harvey and others on this call know better than I, you got to go through a lot of layers. The president isn't just sitting at his desk and he flips the switch and off goes the nuclear weapon. There are a whole lot of people who are involved in that ultimate decision. Now, we did have, and I had with the highest ranking members of the military, some very interesting conversations about what constitutes an illegal order, as we were trying to figure out just how bad the period between November 3rd and January 20th might be, and when the military can say, well, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And that's difficult. Now, if we were to change the construct and say, you've got to get this person, it mixes that a little bit. I don't know that it has a profound effect on the ability of the president to do great damage, even with nuclear weapons. But I'm open to being educated. That well, if we change this and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff and the SecDef had to approve, how does that change the mix? I'm not sure it changes it as materially as some people envision.
Dr. Harvey, do you have any views about sole authorization, and what sort of authorization regime would you want?
I agree with the Congressman Smith. The president is elected by the people. If you elect a president who is going to be irresponsible with nuclear weapons, then you've got a real problem that the law is not going to help you that much with. I think what you need to understand is that the president may be required to make some fairly rapid decisions, given circumstances, with regard to U.S. employment. Well, we would of course like to not have him make a rapid decision. We would like to give him as much decision time as we can. Mr. Obama made that one of the key features of his employment policy, was to increase the decision time he would have in order to make a launch and execution of nuclear forces order. And so but if you start going where you have to get a second confirmation from congressional, for example, authorization to use nukes, or from another person who may not be available when the decision's made, that runs a real risk, and it affects our deterrent. And indeed, I think it degrades it degrades the security of the United States by requiring that. Again, don't elect crazy people to be your president.
And General, the same question to you: sole authorization or safeguards in authorization involving multiple parties?
Thanks, Claire. Our military remains fiercely apolitical. None of us want to live in a country where our military is involved in politics. So I'm gonna just stick to the law itself. I'll leave the policy debate to the extremely capable, distinguished members of the panel other than me. From a purely legal perspective, I'll simply say that taking that power out of the hands of the commander-in-chief does raise some constitutional issues that I think would have to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I want to talk about one sort of technical issue, and then I'm going to invite in Dr. Amy Nelson to join us for the conversation. But Chairman Smith, let me get your views on a host of technological issues that you've thought about, I know, for a long time on the Armed Services Committee. What do we need to do to protect ourselves from this sort of growing evolution of technology, for example, autonomous weapons systems, and the threat that nuclear weapons may pose when linked to those other systems? So cyber, of course, we've seen the extreme insecurity of our cyber systems with the SolarWinds hacking. Autonomous or semi-autonomous systems have long been controversial. What is the risk that as we develop these other greater and greater technological sophistication in other areas, that those technologies will increase the dangers of nuclear weapons by being linked to them, so that we may see development of autonomous nuclear launches with the thought, well, that'll speed up our response time and thus provide better deterrence?
I think the risk is profound on a couple of different levels. The more complicated and more difficult level is the one you point out at the end of the question there. The first one that was occurring to me was, the technological challenges of maintaining your deterrent capability. And I say it that way because there are some that would say the technological challenges of maintaining our military dominance. I don't know if we're going to be able to maintain military dominance, but even being able to maintain our deterrent capability, it is so rapidly changing in terms of how technology can change the very nature of what is effective warfare. And we got to stay ahead. And I think we were at a disadvantage for a while. I think this is changing. And that disadvantage, well, when you're number two, you try harder. When you're number one, you don't, is the bottom line. And, we were out there ahead, and the first Gulf War made it perfectly clear that our way of doing war, we kicked ass at it, and it was great. And if we could keep the rules right there, we were going to be good, but the rules weren't going to stay there. The Russians in particular have gotten very innovative about how to make our information systems vulnerable. The Chinese are right there as well. Increasingly, being effective at deterrent is having the best information systems, making sure that information, number one, you can get access to it, you can process it correctly, you know how to find the nuggets within all of that, and you can get it to the people who need it all the time and not have it be interrupted. We are not well constructed right now for that. We're changing. We're trying to figure it out. We're understanding this. But there's a lot of new systems that arguably are going to be more effective than some of these big fancy weapon systems that we've been developing for the last 20 years. So the technological pace makes us vulnerable in that regard. And then there's the second point you raised, because the thing at the top of all of this is artificial intelligence. And pick your favorite doomsday movie. I just actually watched the Silicon Valley series, where at the end of it, the algorithm that they developed, was so self-correcting that it was going to jeopardize the entire world. So they had to figure out some way to bury it. But yes, no, it is a very real possibility that you can, I don't know that we get to Terminator and machines actually taking over the world, but you can flip a switch and then not know how to unflip it. And when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, that's dangerous. And now we are way past my level of knowledge in terms of how to make that work. All I know is we need to spend a lot of time figuring it out. And I would recommend to everybody the work of Bob Work and Eric Schmidt on the AI Commission that did a deep dive on all of this. And we are now trying to implement their suggestions into law to meet these challenges. Now that's broadly. The nuclear piece is, one particularly dangerous aspect of it. But the broader technological issues are really well looked at in that report and study that they did.
And the DoD directive 3000.09 is important because it does mandate that there be that there be human control over anything in a lethal kill chain, and so that we don't have autonomous weapons self-firing. Maybe General, you want to speak to that issue. It's also your area of expertise, of course.
I will just say that I'm very competitive and I like to win. And in this context, winning means never firing a shot. So I completely agree with the Congressman on the importance of deterrence in this context. When it comes to the combining autonomous weapons systems with nuclear things, my answer in terms of the legality of it and the policy of it are very different. From a legality standpoint, I would say it can be done. It's legal. It's like double embedded hearsay. You have an excited utterance out there that is embedded in a business record. You have to get through both hurdles, and you have to get through the legal hurdles for autonomous weapons. You have to get through the legal hurdles for nuclear weapons use. It can be done. But the risk of nuclear weapons, we've talked about some of them today, is tremendous. The potential risks for autonomous weapons are also very tremendous. And so you have to build in fail safes. You have to address those concerns that the Congressman talked about. You have to have ability to make sure that you don't have unanticipated escalation out there. Very risky. So from a policy standpoint, you really want to make sure you're getting this right and taking all the steps to avoid the potential catastrophe that could ensue if you combine these things in the wrong way. That said, it can be done. And if you're really applying this technology right, we're getting together with the best and brightest minds in the industry where this can be done safely, effectively, and ethically. You talked about the AI ethics principles in the Department of Defense. I've been involved with those with the National Security Commission on AI, the committee led by Bob Work and Eric Schmidt that the Congressman talked about. The DoD itself has run a similar series to ensuring that we are addressing the ethical concerns, the policy concerns that people legitimately have out there. I will tell you that we are very much taking this into account. We are committed to the legal and ethical use of autonomous weapons at all stages. And ultimately, you have to stay ahead of the competition. So we want to do this in a way that effectively deters potential adversaries out there and retains the peace over time.
Well, and I would say it's a real challenge because what makes us more competitive from a deterrence standpoint may be greater automation. And
absolutely. I think you're exactly right. But that is exactly the challenge, and that's where the risk lies. We have to get this right.
That's right. Well, let me now introduce Dr. Amy Nelson. Dr. Nelson is a fellow at the Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction at the National Defense University. A frequent scholar on international negotiations related to nuclear nonproliferation, Dr. Nelson has also served as a fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, a research associate at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland, a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a policy analyst for the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nelson, and I'm sorry to have taken so long to get to you. This is the point at which we really need you in the discussion because I want to talk about how to make us, as a country, as a world, safer going forward, and about negotiations relating to various treaties and agreements that we might make. We're at a very important point with respect to a number of agreements. And the first one that comes to mind, of course, is the Iran nuclear deal, which President Trump took us out of after Obama had spent a good portion of his second term getting us into. And now we are facing the possibility that President Biden, as he has said, will try to get us back into the negotiation, back into the deal. You've done very interesting work looking and compiling data of all of the nuclear-related negotiations that we've had in the past. So can you tell us a little bit about what your data show about what makes for a successful negotiation in this area?
Sure. Well, there are a number of factors. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm pleased to be joining this esteemed panel. There are a lot of factors and a lot of what you get in terms of the kind of negotiation the kind of dialogue you're able to achieve during arms control negotiations, the kind of agreement you're able to get, and whether that agreement ends up being robust and durable are all specific to the context in which the negotiations take place. So nuclear negotiations function a little differently than conventional negotiations. They tend to, for example, Yeah, nuclear agreements are always much shorter in duration and definitely of a limited duration, for example, whereas conventional and other kinds of arms control agreements that are non-nuclear are more likely to be of infinite duration, of extended duration. So in the nuclear space, countries don't want to tie their hands. The technology is changing rapidly. Whoever is your adversary and friend today may not be your friend tomorrow, right? So it's riskier, and countries don't want to tie their hands for as long. And it's a dynamic, strategic space, which warrants ongoing dialogue and repeat negotiations.
And one of the most important things that you told me when we talked about this earlier today was that the success of a negotiation in the nuclear space seems very dependent on the narrowness of the subject that you address. So from that standpoint, President Obama took a very narrow strategy for which many people criticized his approach, but he took the view that we are not going to press Iran on funding terrorism, something that made the agreement and the negotiations very controversial with respect to Israel and those who were concerned to represent Israel's perspective, as well as those of us who work on counterterrorism issues, and just felt, why do we want to turn boatloads of cash over to Iran and have them, send it to Hezbollah? But in effect, your data show that if we had not narrowed our focus, we were at much greater risk of losing the possibility of an agreement here. Let me ask Chairman Smith to weigh in on this as you think about our efforts to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. First of all, do you favor that? And second of all, do you agree that the right strategy is to take a narrow approach to the topic and sort of leave humanitarian and other differences with Iran to one side?
No, I completely agree with what you said. I think you analyzed the exact details and the trade-off of it. And I think the risk of Iran getting a nuclear weapon is so great that should be our focus, number one. Number two, so we say we want Iran to stop sponsoring terrorism around the region, and we do. I have yet to see a path there. So it's not like, okay, if we hold out for doing that, then we can have both. No, what we wind up with is Iran is still supporting terrorists. I mean, ever since we got out of the JCPOA, it's not like they stopped sending money to Yemen or they stopped sending money to Hezbollah or they stopped messing around in Syria or Iraq. They're still screwing around and all that. And now they're closer to a nuclear weapon. It's a lose-lose. The other thing that I feel very strongly about is, I spoke with Wendy Sherman a lot. I spoke with Secretary Kerry and others, and I looked at the agreement. There's a fair amount of dishonesty out there about what the agreement actually had in it, because the two-pronged argument against it was, number one, what you said, and then number two, and furthermore, this doesn't even stop them from getting a nuclear weapon because, a lot of the prohibitions in it are sunsetted. Okay. And there were aspects of it that were sunsetted, but what was never sunsetted was the agreement that Iran would not build another nuclear weapon. Never. Okay. So there was a lot of misinformation spread by those who wanted to, both undermine the specific agreement, and then you have the political people who are trying to bring down the globalists, if you will. Mm-hmm. So they'll say whatever they have to say and tell whatever lie they have to tell in order to make it look like the globalists are up to some, evil series of stupid decisions and all that. So yeah, I don't think we ever should have left the agreement. I think we can get it back. Iran is going to be very difficult to deal with no matter what, but they're going to be a hell of a lot more difficult to deal with if they have a nuclear weapon. And the JCPOA, far and away better than anything else that anyone's put on the table, gave us the best chance of stopping them from getting that nuclear weapon.
One of the ironies, of course, Chairman Smith, is that the point at which we pulled out of the deal was the point at which we had already unfrozen Iranian assets, had already sent them their money. And so the worry about sending those very funds going to terrorism, that, horse was already out of the barn. So now was the point at which we were to reap the benefits of our unfreezing the assets, namely that we get to hold Iran's feet to the fire and that there were going to be inspections and so on. And that's the point at which we pull out. So
I'm sorry, just one little vignette on that. So I actually only met with President Trump on 2 occasions, but one of them was talking about this Iranian stuff. and the whole theory was, we do maximum pressure in Iran. I mean, Trump must have said a dozen times during our meeting, oh, they're begging for a deal. They're begging, they're desperate, which was, total Trumpian BS, just the con man coming out. They weren't even asking for a deal, much less begging. But that was the idea. And look, I get it in negotiations. Anytime you enter a negotiation, the ideal outcome is I get everything I want and you get nothing. Yeah, okay, we'd kind of like to make that work. I don't often see it play out that way. And Iran just ain't gonna do it. So, make your choice. And I'm not saying, I know Iran's terrible, and Secretary Pompeo would give us speeches forever about, no, you don't understand, Iran is terrible. No, got it. Iran, bad, terrible, awful, whatever word you want to use. How are you going to get them to agree to stop doing all of the bad stuff that we'd like them to stop doing? Show me the path. It doesn't exist, so you can't show it to me. Sorry, but that was frustrating.
Right.
We really lost an opportunity there.
Now, Dr. Harvey, you were involved in the 1995 negotiation with the Russians and New START, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about the extension now of New START. I guess we're seeking a 5-year extension, and how you see the the challenges surrounding those negotiations, given the other tensions that we're facing with the Russians, and solar winds and political reprisals and sanctions and so on. Does that cut at cross purposes?
Well, Claire, Joe Biden did the right thing in his first week in office, which was get Putin on the phone and extend New START for 5 years. That was the smart thing to do. It's accomplished. Now the question is, what next? Mm-hmm. And I don't, the things that we're interested in, the large disparity in non-strategic nuclear weapons between us and Russia, some aspects, not all aspects, but some aspects of their exotic nuclear modernization program are areas that we would like to discuss that probably they won't, and they would probably want to discuss missile defense, which we don't want to discuss, which is how it's been for the last sort of 15 years. So I'm not sure where we go from here. I think Joe Biden should make an attempt to engage Mr. Putin on strategic stability discussions, potential further reductions, et cetera. Mr. Obama, in his in his second review of nuclear policy, came to the conclusion that the U.S. with Russia bilateral agreement could reduce to about 1,000, not 1,500. Russia has shown no interest in going down to that level, and the U.S. is not going to go to that level unilaterally. Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be a heavy lift to get anywhere on this, but I think we should try because it's important. It's important for our overall nuclear posture and for support for modernization, which is essential in my view. Support for modernization has part of the deal of it is arms control and threat reduction across the board, and we need to do that. With regard to the Iran treaty, the JPCOA, I'm a little bit of an agnostic. I mean, I think it did one really good thing, which is stop their heavy water production, which is a really short route, much quicker than uranium enrichment to get to a nuclear bomb. Mm-hmm. But the one-year warning time doesn't give me a lot of help because it'll take us 11 months of that 1-year warning time to figure out what to do after we got the warning. So by then they'll have the bomb. So I think the JPCOA should be reinstated because it's part of what I call that comprehensive package that we put together that advances our overall security and which also maintains continued bipartisan support for our nuclear posture.
And Dr. Nelson, you suggested to me that the extension of New START is really
again for good this time. So thank you very much. I appreciate the discussion.
Congressman Smith, thank you so much for joining us. You've suggested that the New START extension is really already a done deal. And the interesting thing that you said to me earlier today is that the tensions surrounding other issues with Russia, such as the SolarWinds hacking and so on, really didn't disrupt our ability to extend that treaty. Would you care to speculate about why that is? Why do negotiations in the nuclear realm seem to be so isolated?
Sure. I think isolated is a great word for it. I mean, whether that was by design or coincidence, it aligns very well with the history of U.S.-Russian nuclear negotiations. The U.S. and Russia, even when relations were at an all-time low, could always talk about strategic arms limitation, and so that fits the pattern. We have a long history negotiating with the Russians now. We have a shared history. We have shared understandings. We have a common lexicon. And so there's a lot there. And then to your point, there's a lot there that's always been stable, even when other issues have come into the mix or other events have sort of disturbed the horizon.
So I'd like to go to our Q&A now. We have a number of interesting questions, and for those members of the audience who are not aware of this, this is the beginning of a two-day conference, this keynote event, in which we'll be talking about the issue of threat escalation and sort of what is left of launch, as the expression goes. And we have a number of distinguished panelists who I wish we were welcoming in person. This conference was supposed to take place a whole year ago, and we put it off with the thought that surely we would be in person by now. I'm dismayed that we're not, but we will look forward to welcoming all of you back again on a future occasion. But let me get some of the questions from our very distinguished participants who will be joining us for 2 days worth of panels. I have a question here from Charlie Dunlap. Professor Dunlap says, doesn't the U.S. reserve the right to belligerent reprisals? The Obama-era law of war manual quotes Abraham Sofair as to why the U.S. is not a party to Protocol 1, which forbids reprisals against civilians, because, quote, an enemy could deliberately carry out attacks against friendly civilian populations, and the United States would be legally forbidden to reply in kind. So, Professor Dunlap asks, isn't there a clear legal basis to use the weapons in reprisal? Moreover, haven't several nations who are parties to Protocol 1 filed reservations that exclude nuclear weapons from its application? So that's a lot to answer. I'm going to come to you, General Huston. Do you want to at least take on the first part of it about the right to belligerent reprisals?
I will say I could not possibly come up with a better answer than General/Professor Dunlap laid out there in that question partially himself. There certainly is a debate about the legitimacy of belligerent reprisals, and I think I'm going to just say that it's somewhat unresolved. That historically, there is a right under international law for belligerent reprisals. The use of that in the context here is, I think, a bit debatable, but I think probably beyond the scope of what we're here to do today.
Okay, does anybody else want to speak to that issue? Dr. Nelson, do you have any thoughts about reprisals, or Dr. Harvey?
No, I don't.
Okay, and I'm going to get one more question in from I'm saying professor because it's his current role, but General Dunlap, which was a question for the Congressman, but maybe some of our other panelists would like to answer it. Is it your position that there is no possibility that an adversary could develop a DNA-devised biological weapon in a deeply buried, that is, beyond the destructive power of a conventional weapon, that would have devastating effect on certain ethnic groups? And the only way to be certain that that capacity was destroyed, if it was about to be used, was with a nuclear weapon. Would we want the U.S. to refrain from using a nuclear weapon even under those circumstances? Great question. Let me throw it out to the panel. Who wants to answer that?
I'll take a
I
stab.
get the question.
No,
Was
go
it,
ahead.
what did he was saying that there was a deep underground facility that was doing what?
So imagine, I'm gonna let Dr. Nelson answer first. Is it our position, let me put it that way, that an adversary could develop a DNA devised biological weapon? Okay, so imagine a massive biological weapon that would have.
Do you mean WMD device? You mean WMD or DNA?
No, a DNA devised biological weapon, a biological weapon. And so the question that would have a devastating effect on certain ethnic groups. And the question was, could we use, I think it's a question about first use. Could we use a weapon of mass destruction preemptively to destroy such a biological device? First, Dr. Nelson.
Great, thanks. So this is very much a CRISPR question and an emerging technologies question. And would the US essentially be willing to use a nuclear weapon, its most tried and true proven weapon of mass destruction, preemptively against an emerging technology-driven attack? It's a great scenario, and imagination can be useful here. I think that whatever the answer is for CRISPR and for a biologically enhanced attack in this way would have to be generalized to any other kind of threat from any other kind of emerging tech-enabled device or set of technologies. So I would be concerned about broadening the scope of acceptable use to include something non-nuclear, although we have this conversation regularly about cyber. Is a critical infrastructure cyber attack equivalent to, does it warrant a nuclear response? Can we use nuclear to deter a cyber attack? We can do whatever we want because these are shared ideas, right?
And so, yeah, and this is really, I think, a version of the question that I asked the congressman, which is, there's, in your view, really no preemptive use that would be legal, and so therefore no first use. Are you really comfortable ruling out all first uses of nuclear weapons? And he said, I am, but his answer was not so much based on law as more based on policy, if I understood correctly. General, you look like you have something to say on this.
Well, I agree with you. I do believe this question is designed to tease out the propriety of a no first strike policy. I think, as I expressed before, the legal issues, there is no legal prohibition on the use of nuclear weapons if it could be employed in a manner that would be, that's clearly a valid military target, and the only question would come down to the proportionality analysis in this case. The policy debate, as I said before, I'm going to stay out of the policy debate just because I think it's the right thing for me to do, not appropriate for me to go into a policy debate on that type of issue.
Dr. Harvey, did you want to speak to this issue?
If the technology exists to do this damage to an ethnic group, and it has not been executed, it has not been used yet, then I would do everything I could militarily. I advise the President and Secretary of Defense, do everything we could to try to deny that capability, but not with nuclear weapons. If the attack has been executed and hundreds of thousands of people are dying as a result, then I would want nuclear use against the deep underground facility to be an option for the president.
Good. I want to combine here two questions that Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell asks. And the first one was for Congressman Smith, unfortunately, but she says, deterrence based on the threat to use nuclear weapons for mutually assured destruction is an intellectual construct. Are we not long overdue to deconstruct it? And isn't it based on a morally and legally repugnant idea? And then she says in a second comment that international law is the common normative bond we share globally. We should all be committed to the rule of law, especially in the category of the use of lethal force, not to mention weapons of mass destruction. And if I put those two comments together, I think the point is really why are we so wedded to deterrence? We're prepared to say, well, if we do X, deterrence won't work, and if we do Y, deterrence won't work. Why don't we start the other way around with what does the rule of law require of us? And don't we have a better shot at a common language with our allies and against our adversaries if we start from what's legal rather than doing everything we can to save our deterrence posture? General, do you want to speak to that?
I'll just say I do believe that deterrence is certainly a legal option. It is a policy matter. I think it's a proven strategy. It has proven effective. It is as repugnant as it has been. It has seemed to be effective for the past 76 years. And there's no arguing with that. Now, it may not be due to that, but I'd like to see an alternative strategy that we think is better. And obviously, we need to start with the basis that whatever strategy we pick has to be legal, and then find one that's better. I'm just not aware of one. I'm a believer in winning through not fighting if we can, and I think deterrence so far has been successful.
Successful, but have we satisfied ourselves on the legality question? And I think Professor O'Connell might say successful is not the test of this.
I don't know of anyone who thinks that, I don't know of a solid argument that deterrence itself is illegal.
And I think that's part of what we were exploring with threats, but okay, that's an answer. Let me get some more questions in here. A question from Christopher Ford, unfortunately for Congressman Smith, who's no longer with us, but no first use seems sensible if you assume a priori that there is no role for nuclear weapons in deterring conventional military aggression. But if there is any role for nuclear weapons in deterring non-nuclear attack, a no first use policy would seem to undermine the extended deterrence that the U.S. offers its allies. For example, it would tell Russia and China that they can invade our allies with no fear of our nuclear weapons as long as they don't themselves use nuclear weapons in the process. Under a no first use policy, how would you compensate for this loss of deterrence against conventional attack? This is a great question, and I wish that Congressman Smith were here to answer it. But does anyone want to take a stab at answering if you do defend no first use?
I think Chris is absolutely right. And indeed, that's the arguments that allies provide us, is that our country can get destroyed pretty easily by this behemoth on our borders. I'm talking about our NATO allies that basically confront the potentially hostile Russia. They don't want us to take anything off the table in ensuring that their country maintains its sovereignty and integrity. So I think I think that is one of the risks I spoke to regarding no first use. And I think that the other thing I want to say about no first use, which I didn't say in my first intervention, was just because we reject the no first use pledge, it does not mean that the U.S. has a first use policy. Indeed,
Yes,
the use
right.
of nuclear weapons by the U.S. has been stated by many, many presidents and administrations as to be one in which extreme national interests are at risk and would be a very, very unusual and rare occurrence, not just something you'd use to use in a conventional conflict, for example.
Well, and one of the really big questions about is deterrence working, and I take Christopher Ford's question to be saying not only is deterrence working in a nuclear context, but is it actually working to deter conventional aggression, say because of fear of escalation, is to think about the risks of non-state actor groups or rogue nations, but especially let's focus on non-state actor groups at the moment getting a hold of nuclear weapons and being able to use them. Do we want to hang on to the deterrence philosophy in a world in which it's not just us and one or maybe two other superpowers? Deterrence seems a lot more sensible when you're talking about just us and the Russians.
Well, deterrence has nothing to do with terrorists. Okay, we don't. Our nuclear weapons don't deter terrorists.
Well,
And we acknowledge that.
right, but when we also start thinking about the fear, the possibility of nuclear weapons metastasizing around the globe, and imagine ISIS had a nuclear weapon. Do we think that the old deterrence framework is really going to be the way to go, or do we think that we need to start really reducing our nuclear arsenal to reduce those risks, the risks that terrorists can get their hands on nuclear weapons, because we're just not playing in a deterrence framework anymore. Anyone want to take a stab at that, Dr. Nelson?
I don't think it has to be either or. And I'm not sure that you have to reduce your nuclear inventory just to prevent the terrorists from getting their hands on nuclear weapons. You could simply increase the security to where the terrorists couldn't get their hands on nuclear weapons, or make it more difficult to do so.
The premise of your question, Claire, is that countries make decisions about what they do with regard to acquiring their own nuclear weapons, or cooperating with the United States on a robust non-proliferation regime, based on what the U.S. does in its nuclear weapons and modernization program, and the fact that it may not be reducing nuclear forces as fast as certain countries may want. But that's not the case. There's no evidence at all that states make decisions to cooperate with us or not to acquire their own nuclear weapons based on what the U.S. does in its nuclear.
Oh no, yeah, it's not actually the premise. The premise of my question, or my interpretation, in effect, of this question, is that the pressure on us to modernize and increase our nuclear forces has to do with the philosophy of deterrence, and the risk of non-state actors acquire nuclear weapons increases the more we all increase our forces. Right, assuming that we are still in an implicit arms race.
Let me be clear about the modernization. Our modernization program is to basically replace systems that are aging out and that will very likely fall off the cliff of performance in the next 5 to 10 years if we don't take steps. So if we don't modernize, we got to get rid of stuff. So that's unilateral disarmament. In the U.S., that's not a policy of the United States. The U.S. is modernizing in order to replace the capabilities that it has today that are aging out.
Based on the philosophy of
not necessarily provide new military capabilities, but to ensure a level of deterrence that we have today.
Well, right, it's based on deterrence. However, the more we pursue deterrence, the greater the risk of nuclear terrorism becomes. That's the argument.
I don't buy that.
You don't believe that.
One moment.
Dr. Nelson, do you want to speak to that?
I mean, I think a more interesting question, and where I thought we were going with this, was would the U.S. want to have a no first use policy in a world in which ISIS had nuclear weapons? And I think you'd have a much easier time getting consensus on that. But I think what's happening here is we're making our way through the list of possible actors and the list of possible threats. Which is, in a sense, how we're kind of determining the boundaries of acceptable use of nuclear weapons. But more than that, I don't have much.
Let's be clear about no first use. No first use would be a policy that the U.S. would define for itself. A policy can be reversed in an instant. Therefore, no country is going to base any of its security decisions on whether the U.S. has a no first use policy or not, because it can be changed instantly. And the other thing is, China does have a no first use policy, or at least it had, or at some point had. And the question is, had that affected at all the U.S. posture with regard to nuclear deterrence towards China? And I think the answer is, hell no.
And a question for you, while I have you, Dr. Harvey, talking about this, from Pavel Podvig, regarding no first use. Could you, he asks, elaborate on why exactly the Allies would feel that the U.S. commitment to protect them would be eroded if the U.S. adopts no first use? What would be the scenario here?
You have to talk to the allies about that. I've been in conversations with them. I've heard some of in private conversations with allied officials of allied governments, and they are very touchy on anything we do. If we were to decide to go on if Mr. Biden decides to go the route of no first use, he would be well advised to basically spend a lot of time engaging our allies to make sure that we find a way to manage the concerns that they have. Otherwise, that could be a real risk for nonproliferation. I mean, if the allies think we're backing away from our deterrence commitment, including nuclear extended deterrence, boy, that is a good reason for them who live in very, very hostile security environments to acquire their own nuclear weapons. And boy, that is not in the U.S. national interest for that.
And by the way, Kevin Govern, Searle board member, points out that Joe Biden has previously strongly supported making a no first use pledge, but as president, he has yet to comment on it. So we shall see where we stand with that. Let me get a few more questions here from other people. We have a PhD candidate from the University of Hong Kong, Naraj Nair, who asks, can a long-term policy of maintaining deterrent capability be reconciled with the SEND, creating an environment conducive to nuclear disarmament initiative? Who would like to answer that question?
Chris Ford might.
Yes, I do wish, and I should have said previously that Chris Ford just left his position as Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation at the State Department, and I really do wish that we could have all of our conference participants up in the Zoom with us, because we have many people who are incredibly knowledgeable, and I look forward to the next few days of discussion. But any thoughts about that question? Creating an environment conducive to nuclear disarmament. Does maintaining our commitment to deterrence really undermine our commitment to maximizing the chances, let's say, of disarmament?
Look, I think Chris Ford, in his time in the Trump administration, did some very, very interesting things, innovative approaches to the nonproliferation community. One of the things he posed is, what would be the criteria under which the U.S. might be able to accept a world without nuclear weapons? And it involves, two or three things. First of all, it involves a much different world than we're living in today. The second thing, it involves an ability to be able to understand that countries who'd agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons have gotten rid of them. And the third thing is, when the country cheats and has a couple hundred nuclear weapons and now has become the sole superpower, how do you enforce their violation of the treaty? So there are a lot of very complex issues. Chris actually put these on the table, which was, I thought, quite unusual for this previous administration. And I think he got people talking in the right direction, because they'll become to understand how complex and how difficult disarmament is. And it's not going for quite a long time replace deterrence in the international security arena, in my view.
So I want to ask another question. This one is from another Searle board member, Jules Zacher, who has been very instrumental in this conference and is vastly more knowledgeable than I am on these issues. And so I've benefited a lot from his advice. And he wants to talk about GBSD, which I had asked the panelists earlier before we started about, which stands for ground-based strategic. Now, you corrected me, Harvey. I said defense, but I think it's deterrent, yeah?
Right.
Okay. But the question is that a first-use weapon? And as such, does it violate IHL? Of course, we haven't committed to the proposition that IHL rules out first use, but
I'll go on the record saying I don't think that IHL rules out first use.
Well,
Right, and some of the
the question is whether an ICBM is a first use weapon.
That is the question, yeah.
And
Let's start with that.
the scenario that people use to argue this case is a massive, let's say the only country that can do that today is Russia, a massive Russia strike on US ICBM fields, that which basically destroys those fields if they're not launched out, if they're not launched before the Russian warheads arrive. And therefore, since they're not survivable, the argument is they can only be used first. Well, that's a gross oversimplification. The ICBM force, the president has the capability to launch the ICBMs rapidly if he chooses to, in the event of a counterforce strike by the United States against our ICBM fields. Whether any president would use that capability is unknowable. And indeed, in my own personal view, a president would probably wait to see what happened before he decided what to do. And that's why we maintain submarines at sea, to ensure that even if we lost our ICBMs, we would have a sufficient retaliatory force to deter any such threats. And that's what we maintain. The ICBM is a useful piece of the nuclear triad because it's always alert. You don't have to take a provocative step to alert it like you do with the bombers. It's very cheap to operate. It provides the president an option to be able to hold at risk a facility within a short period, which every president back through Kennedy has sought. And it is, again, some people talk of them as being a sponge. I don't think of them that way.
Right.
The thing they do is they provide a capability for us to hedge uncertainty in, for example, in the risk to our submarine force from technological advances. So there's a very strong case for the ICBM force for GBSD because we need GBSD to replace Minuteman III, which is aging out. And every president back since Kennedy has had ICBMs in our nuclear force, and there is no sentiment in Congress to get rid of them.
General, did you want to add anything on ICBMs?
Nope, nothing else.
Okay, I do want to tell you, pushing back at you a little bit on your statement that IHL does not rule out first use. Professor O'Connell says it absolutely does under Article 2.4 and Article 51, namely the right to use force without Security Council authorization exists only if an armed attack occurs. So she suggests that means no first use.
Now, I disagree with that. First of all, you could have a UN Security Council resolution that authorized the use of all necessary force, and that could include a nuclear strike of first use. Second, you would have an armed attack against a nation that was a non-nuclear attack, and you could respond in self-defense with a nuclear strike.
And that's the preemptive question, in effect, that I asked.
Yeah, even if it was not preemptive, even if it was after an armed attack, you could respond with a nuclear strike or preemptively.
To a conventional attack.
Yes, absolutely.
So that would be the argument. Well, I hope that Mary Ellen will defend her position in the days to come. I have a question from Charlie Moxley, and let me throw this out to the panel. Two questions. First, in applying rules like proportionality and distinction, do we consider foreseeable effects like the spread of radiation or the potential for nuclear winter and nuclear escalation? And then second, do we apply such tests only against the expected effects of the potential nuclear weapons uses or also against possible effects? Do we consider the full range of foreseeable potential effects? And I guess I would want to add to that, maybe to sharpen the question a little bit, no matter what the likelihood. So, do we account for unlikely but foreseeable effects? Dr. Harvey, I'm sorry.
No, the difference here would be from a legal perspective versus a policy perspective. From a policy perspective, I think we would consider everything. But what does the law require? What's the black letter law? The black letter law requires the expected effects. And it's like approximate cause where there's a certain fairness that at some point the expected effects are too attenuated to really be counted. But that's just the legal analysis. From a policy standpoint, I think you would look at long-term effects. A nuclear Armageddon, a nuclear winter, well, that's the sort of thing we'd want to consider before the use of nuclear weapons. This is where the near pacifist in me comes out. I think those are absolutely valid and important considerations from a policy standpoint, but just understanding the distinction between the black letter law and then policy distinctions.
Dr. Harvey, do you have anything this is a version of a question I asked you about what range of effects we consider when we do that legal analysis sort of warhead by warhead?
I think we look at casualties, we look at the long-term casualties, long-term cancer deaths, and those kinds of things in terms of the calculation. But I mean, a nuclear war will be a horrible thing. Okay, it will be beyond all comprehension in terms of damage and destructiveness that occur with even a moderate exchange of nuclear weapons. And that's the dilemma we're in with deterrence. I mean, we have deterred major conventional conflict along the lines of World War I and World War II for 75 years. I mean, that's no small feat when you look at how many folks have died in those wars and as a result of those wars. I can't prove to you that nuclear weapons were the factor in preventing those major conflicts, but I think there sure is a strong correlation between that would reinforce. So I think there are lots of things that could affect people, some of which we don't fully understand. For example, the climatic effects. We want to avoid. Obviously we never want to use them, but because they exist, we have to deal with them, and we have to deal with them in a way. And look at even at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. and Russia made enormous progress in taking their nuclear weapon stockpiles down from 30,000 to under 5,000 for the United States. And that's a remarkable progress. And we're looking to go further. And Mr. Obama set us up to go further. The problem is getting the Russians to go along with it.
And by the way, we're just about out of time, but I just add here that Christopher Ford says that on the DNA weapon hypothetical, he points out that the Obama administration's 2010 nuclear posture review reserved the right to threaten nuclear use in response to a biological weapons attack. And that the Trump administration's 2018 review also encompassed this significant non-nuclear strategic attack. Let me close then by asking you each to say a few words about what you'd like to see in the next nuclear posture review. We're coming up on one. We expect that, I suppose we may have one issued sometime this summer. What words of advice would you like to give? And General, if you'd like to treat this as a narrower legal question, feel free to do that. What legal issues need to be clarified in the next nuclear posture review? Dr. Harvey, let me start with you. We have just a few minutes for each one of your comments.
Well, here's what our nuclear posture consists of: a whole lot of things, including not just our nuclear weapons, but our arms control policies, our threat reduction policies, our nuclear counterterrorism policies, and everything. That's our nuclear security. What I'd like to see Mr. Biden reaffirm the changed security environment since the time that he was involved in the NPR back in 2010. I'm hoping that it will reaffirm long-term elements of U.S. policy and posture. I hope that he will maintain the Modernization Program for U.S. nuclear forces with maybe an adjustment here or there, a small adjustment. I'd like him to continue to pursue with Russia and China discussions on arms control and strategic stability and transparency, but I don't think he should do it the way Mr. Trump did, which was try to do a trilateral. I think that's a non-starter.
Views on the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Should the U.S. take a position on that?
Well, the U.S. position on that is the right one, which is we reject it. It is a it's an irresponsible interaction from a few in the international community to basically reaffirm what they've already reaffirmed, which they're not going to acquire nuclear weapons. None of the states with nuclear weapons think that this is a plausible thing. So you're not going to get, whatever the US does, you're not going to get Russia, China, France, or the UK to do it either. So I'd like to see him reaffirm the JPCOA, and I hope he affirms a robust non-proliferation agenda. So all of those pieces form a comprehensive strategy that will help protect the American people.
Dr. Nelson, same question to you. What would you like to see in the next nuclear posture review?
Great. Well, that was an excellent wish list. I don't know if I can top that, but part and parcel with the reaffirmation of the changed security environment, I'd really like to see language that reflects a deep reconsideration of fundamental concepts on which our nuclear security is built, namely strategic stability and deterrence. At the WMD Center, we're increasingly confronted with the question of how emerging technologies change our fundamental assumptions about weapons of mass destruction, from altering how we think about strategic stability, which presupposes a bright dividing line between conventional and nuclear weapons use, to how emerging technologies reduce the ambiguity on which we rely for deterrence. So no longer, it's not such an obvious statement, the threat that leaves something to chance or to hold adversaries' targets at risk. Deeper thinking is called for at this point in time. And with respect to arms control, I feel arms control has gotten just such a bad rap. I feel like it's deeply misunderstood. It's a security tool that should be applied judiciously, surgically, and incrementally. It's incredibly successful when it's well understood and used appropriately. We cheer arms control because the wins feel big and they're emotional achievements, but it's never been a panacea. It's never been a cure-all. We've had major breakthroughs on arms control, but there's a lot that we can be doing. There's a lot that we should be doing that's, less flashy, doesn't get as many headlines. It's incremental, but we need to see it as a cumulative process. And as much as we can communicate that to the publicly and maybe rehabilitate arms control's public image, I think we would be improving the security of the United States that way.
General Huston.
I know we're short on time, so I will.
Last comment, you get the last word. What legal questions need to be clarified that could be taken up in the nuclear posture review?
I don't think that's the place to clarify those, but I will say this has been a fantastic discussion, and we have identified that the international legal baseline is one place, and then the policy that can transcend that is something totally altogether different. And when it comes to that, I really am a believer, a pursuer of peace, and I believe that deterrent is the best way to achieve that peace, and deterrence through strength. And I think that's been effective, and I think that it should maintain that as part of the policy.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you all for this very interesting discussion. Rich, I don't know if you can unmute yourself for a minute. Put your camera on. I'd like to thank Rich Meyer for everything he has done to make this panel a success, but also the conference that we'll be having in the next few days. We were very lucky that Rich was able to join Searle at the moment that he did, and also Jules Zacher, who was not able to unmute a camera picture, but very, very grateful for everything that Jules did to make this happen. And I very much look forward to our discussion in the next few days, and to having you all back to University of Pennsylvania when you are able to come in person. So thank you again, and thanks to everyone watching, and to all our participants who asked excellent questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about them over the next few days. Thank you very much.